It's easy to say that the cross is at the front when the bookends are so violent compared to the selfless son. But I've tried to be, and I've tried to see like him.
Welcome to Apocalypse here for a special Halloween edition of our podcast. But yeah, we're excited to have this one. We got Laura Robinson on with us. We're going to be talking about demons, spiritual warfare, Satan, stuff along those lines. And we're going to, just to kind of lay it out, we'll start off with sort of a New Testament approach, more biblical understanding of like what does Paul think, gospel authors think, stuff like that in the beginning, and then from there we'll talk more about how this plays into a kind of wider theological understanding of, you know, evil, spiritual warfare, Satan, all these things like I mentioned. So that's kind of a layout of what we're going to be talking about. But before we get started with anything else, just want to mention thank everybody for watching. If you could like the video, subscribe to the channel, and our link to our Discord's in the description, as well as a link to the Patreon if you want to check that out and support us in that way. It's patreon.com/apocalypse here. But yeah, so I'll kind of throw it over to Laura since she hasn't actually been on episode of the podcast yet to kind of just give some introductory thoughts or say anything if she wants to.
Well, first and foremost, I'm sorry about my disaster with background. I'm just sort of slowly packing up my office right now as we get ready for the final move to Indy. If you guys have been following that story, the fact that we're going home. Woo! But yeah, no, spiritual warfare. This is a subject I find very interesting because of how I grew up. I grew up in churches that were very traditional and conservative in a lot of ways. I grew up is basically an evangelical Quaker, but the Quakerism thing kind of there were some Christian culture things that came down the pipeline and some things that did not. And then when I got to be a teenager, spiritual warfare and the idea that demons were sort of an ever-present part of reality that you had to grapple with or you might be oppressed by at any time started to be more of a thing. So I'm really interested in the subject, especially as a historian and as a theologian and as someone who studies the New Testament.
I think the place to kind of kick this off, especially with your expertise in the New Testament, so Laura didn't mention this. For those of you who may not know Laura, even though I don't know why you wouldn't, Laura is a New Testament candidate at Duke University in religious studies, specializing in the New Testament, working specifically on the book of Matthew. But I think a good place to start would be with Mark's gospel, because Mark is sort of the exorcist gospel or exorcism gospel. You get that kind of all over the place in Mark. And I think that would be a good place to kind of begin talking about these things, and the way that somebody like the author of Mark talks about demons. No, I mean, obviously Mark is really foundational for how for the New Testament perspective on demons. They are a pervasive theme in Mark's gospel, and some of those themes get borrowed in Matthew and Luke. They're not in John. John does not have exorcisms. Sort of an interesting characteristic of John's gospel, but it's the inaugural miracle in Mark's gospel. First thing Jesus does is perform an exorcism. The vision of demons that is put forward in Mark is very dependent on the idea of souls being sort of animating agents in a body, so to speak, like these spirits that inhabit people, that you are inhabited by your spirit and your spirit makes you do things. And the understanding of what a demon does in Mark is that the spirit who would normally drive your body, your spirit is displaced and taken over by some other intelligence that takes over you and starts running the show. And the job of the exorcist in the book of Mark, for example, is that they get that other spirit to leave. Through exorcism is a huge field in the ancient world. This is often done with incantations, knowing the secret names of demons or the powers of demons, that kind of things, magical or ritual objects or artifacts that might be able to keep them away. But the goal is to drive away a demon to keep them away permanently. So this happens somewhat frequently in Mark.
Also, in keeping with the first century mindset of demons, is that demons have a lot of geographical ties and significance. A lot of divinity in the ancient world does this. You know, the idea that the god of a certain nation, you can hear that god can hear you and see you as long as you are in their nation. And then once you go beyond that, things change a little bit. In Mark, what we see is sort of the standard idea that demons are associated with bodies of water in particular. This is associated with the chaos monster idea, the idea that the oceans are full of these sort of anti-god, anti-order forces. So when we have the story of the Gadarene demoniacs, for instance, these it's just one in Mark, actually, it's two in Matthew. The Gadarene demoniac, the bound man who can't be chained in place. It's not a coincidence he's right by the ocean, right? That's where the demons are. There's this horrible storm when Jesus is going across the ocean at them. There's evidence of all this demonic activity. But that's how demons work. They hang out around deep water. That's where they like to hang out. That's where they live. That's where they're sent at the end of the Gadarene demoniac story, right back where they belong, into the water. And they're also associated with sort of like ritually unclean things, right? In this case, the spirits of the dead and the caves. So these are a lot of ancient ideas about demons, ancient Jewish ideas about demons that are being pulled through in the book of Mark, and I think have a somewhat scattershot influence on the way people today think about demons. If you're a Christian who thinks about demons at all, it's not very likely you associate with them with water the way Mark would have, I don't think. You know, I've never been on a church picnic or camping trip by a body of water where anyone asks, you know, well, are there demons in that, right? You know, that's not super common. So people might think that they're getting demonic ideas, images of the demonic, demonology from Mark, but in some ways they really critically aren't. And I think that's really worth looking at, is how different this image is from what we have today. The other thing I don't think is necessarily shared between the modern Christian and Mark is that theological anthropology of the spirit being something that animates the body, right? I think a lot of Christians have a more unified understanding of how the ghost in the machine, so to speak, not quite so attached to this idea of this detachable agent who sort of comes in and runs the show and that sort of thing.
That's interesting. It's the first kind of question that came up when you were talking about Mark and the sort of the idea that are the sort of thing that's driving or animating a body or a person gets replaced by a demon or the demonic, because sometimes it's, you know, not just a individual kind of demon that comes in. We get a sort of legion that comes in.
Right.
It's not just substituting in one kind of discrete kind of animate thing with another. The thing that came to mind was what happens in the sort of ancient conception of this with the original animating thing. Where does it go somewhere? Does it stay there? How does that kind of
I was literally going to ask the exact same question. Just
the very literal language of Mark is that the possessed man, and so Mark 1 has a synagogue exorcism, right? Where Jesus is preaching in a synagogue and a man comes in, and the literal language is that he comes in an unclean spirit, which seems to suggest that there's sort of this, like, the demon is like over the top of him.
Oh, okay.
And like oppressing him in some capacity. That's the imagery. I mean, it depends how much you want to push the language, right? Because, like, obviously prepositions and languages are very slippery. But the image seems to be of a suppression thing, that a demon has come over the top of this man and, like, overtaken him and is driving the show. So this whatever is in this man that would normally be his animating agent is not active.
Okay, so the animating thing that is demonic is sort of, not to kind of split this up in terms of interior and exterior, but it's kind of suppressing from the outside.
Think of a carjacker.
Okay.
I think that's probably the imagery. Think of a carjacker, right? Yeah. When you're still in the car, right? Or like hijacking a plane actually might be the better image then. Because when a plane is hijacked, the pilot doesn't leave the plane usually because
it doesn't have any influence anymore.
Cannot drive the plane anymore. Yeah, exactly. I think that's probably the image.
Yeah. The reason that question came to my mind, like, and that answer is good, is fine. But I was just thinking, like, when like an exorcism takes place, the demon seems to leave and like go somewhere else.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
it does like the person leave
The
and go
carjacker is
somewhere else.
arrested.
Yeah, but no.
Yeah.
So that's that makes sense.
Yeah, the spirit of the person does not need to be called back in biblical demonology or in New Testament demonology. That's not true of a lot of cultures' demonology. The monks do not have this idea that the spirit of the person can be divorced entirely from the body and bringing them back is a separate process. But yeah, no, in New Testament demonology, once the overpowering agent is expelled, the person is able to regain control of their faculties.
Right.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to do some comparison of what you've just been talking about in Mark specifically with somebody like Paul, who is very different. And Paul is really for those of you who don't know, Paul is writing earlier than Mark. So Paul is our earliest New Testament witness. And I think, you mentioned before we started this, talking a bit about Colossians with this. So do you want to kind of talk a bit about what Colossians is doing with the demonic?
Cards on the table. I think Paul wrote Colossians. I know that makes me a little edgy in some circles, but
you're safe here, obviously.
What?
You're safe here, obviously.
Carl behind you.
Carl Bart showing up.
Yeah, coming to see us.
See his butt.
Yeah, no. So I think Colossians is representative of Paul, and in Colossians you have a very different image of what these demonic forces are. The primary mechanism by which the demonic works its will in Mark is possession, right? A demon comes in and takes over somebody's body and then drives their decisions and causes all this like chaos and destruction. That's not what you see in Paul. In Paul, the array of tools, the variety of tools that the demonic world has accessible to it is significantly larger, because the demonic beings for Paul are not quite so personal, and they're not so tied up in the personal, right? So the language Paul uses to describe the demonic is the powers, the authorities, these kinds of things, right? It's a bit Golden Compass if you read those books. But yeah, so for Paul, it's the forces, non-forces, almost anti-forces, these things that seem to be in and around and through the universe, operating through physical means, through the flesh, and have some ability to wreak destruction and wreak havoc on people. The way Paul describes the power, it does not seem so clear that being could come drive a person, right? It couldn't operate the way somebody's animating principle is, so to speak, right? These are more things like standards and codes and laws, like the written record is the thing that shows up in Colossians, for example, right? Or like the elemental spirits. These are these sort of like forces and norms that are at work in the world that are against God, that are on the are advancing the causes of sin and death. John, you might have a bit more to say on the subject than I do. Obviously, Mark and Matthew and Luke are where I'm much more comfortable. Do you think that's a good characterization of Colossians?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that coheres with what Paul says elsewhere about sort of, especially with Satan and also the powers elsewhere. Yeah. Elemental spirits too. That's a kind of a debatable thing in terms of whether or not they're basically demonic, but because that's Galatians, if I'm remembering right.
Yeah, I think Galatians. Spirits.
I'm not so sure, but I just don't really know where I land on that. But you're right about demons are the demonic, and Satan, which seems to be a sort of the kind of figurehead of these powers that are anti-God. The accuser, right? That are in some sense, to use apocalyptic language, waging war. So spiritual warfare stuff does kind of arise out of these texts. But I think there's a way that Paul would be conceptualizing this as a kind of battle in some ways between God and anti-God forces. But for him, obviously, these things are defeated in the cross and resurrection.
Critical difference between Paul and a lot of Jewish apocalyptic writers.
Absolutely. Paul's using apocalyptic Paul's using apocalyptic language. But he's adapting it and using it Christologically. In a way that other people of his time aren't actually really doing. In the same sort of way. But I think it's all tied up together in this kind of nexus of powers that Paul thinks need to be eradicated. And he thinks those things have been eradicated in Christ and will finally be eradicated in the resurrection. of really the cosmos in the end.
But that's right. I think a key difference is that in Mark, a demon is more like an intelligence. It's more like a person. And in Paul, at least in Paul, it's almost more like a rule. That like the idea that things are enslaved to other things. It's sort of, for Paul, the powers are not the enslaving thing. They're like the state of enslavement almost. It's more of a norm is what I see when I look at Paul. But
which makes sense because he does attach this sort of negative construct to the letter occasionally.
Yes, exactly.
He sees that it can sort of take up residence in something like the Torah,
right?
And do damage through that, which is why for him that can kill. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I don't think Paul would be so brazen as to say that there is this being called Satan who has like a personality and who's been created by God who uses the Torah for negative ends. I don't think that's something Paul would say.
I guess a question I kind of have, would you say Paul like is necessarily disagreeing with the author of Mark's conception of demons, or is he kind of talking about something different, right? Because even like you could understand like the more important thing to worry about being more what Paul's talking about, these like rules and like things that influence people in like big picture ways. But maybe he still thinks that more personal demons exist. It's just not kind of something he's talking about. Yeah, not that we could probably even really answer that, but just, obviously.
So one of the differences here is actually might be regional, to be honest. Sociologically speaking, cultures are a lot more likely to experience possession phenomena if there is social unrest or oppression happening. There's Walter Wink has a few studies about this, about the way in which possession phenomena show up in places where one power is sort of occupying another power, right? Which is the same structure that happens in a possession situation, right? A demon comes in and occupies your body. Sociologically, it stands to reason that Judea would be more vulnerable to this kind of phenomenon than a Greco-Roman city that has been fully integrated into the empire, right? On one hand, if you're in Greece, the Romans are still technically occupying you, but if you share a lot more cultural values and that kind of thing, it might not feel the same way, right? And this is like, I don't know. I went through a phase where I just went down a huge rabbit hole reading about like the sociological phenomena of possession and where these things come from. And I cannot explain this. I really can't. But it is it stands to reason Judea in the first century would have more possession experiences than like Pisidian Antioch would.
Yeah, it reminds me of sort of more recently with Global South stuff. I mean, that's where really a lot of the
South Africa has an exorcism tradition.
Yeah, so you're
and like I said, I can't explain it, right?
Yeah.
The in-culture explanation, I think, would be that these demonic forces come in with the invading power, right? And that's what happens, right? And then I think the more psychological answer would be that people experience their nations being occupied by internalizing and sublimating this and experiencing their bodies as being occupied, right?
Sure.
I'm not gonna pretend I have an answer on that, right? But it's a fascinating sociological pattern.
So there's not like necessarily a sort of unified Second Temple Jewish understanding of demons that like Mark is talking. Like I don't know, would Paul need to explain if he was thinking differently or something along those lines? Is kind of what I'm. You know what I mean? Like if Mark's saying one thing and Paul's saying another, is that normal? Like is that kind of just they're not sure? There's not a unified understanding, so it's not strange to see this difference.
This is kind of the nature of Second Temple Judaism, is that it is variegated. It is it's not this one sort of monolithic thing, even though
for sure
some people will want to say that, not to name names. I do think it does happen though, that we think of Second Temple Judaism as a single thing, when what we get clearly from the New Testament itself is like very different kinds of Second Temple Judaisms that are running around, that the different authors or
Galilee is going to look very different from Jerusalem, is going to look very different from Alexandria, right?
I do think I think the geographical point is really, really important too. Is that there's a difference between somebody who's writing Mark and then a missionary running around the ancient Mediterranean going through Roman colonies. He's going to have a different understanding of what's going on with
the Corinthians. Might not have experienced possession. You know, like I think if they had, Paul would come up with an explanation for it. But I think all indications are that the Corinthians did not experience possession. You know, but the Galileans absolutely did.
Yeah.
So that's, you know, I think that's probably where you see the differences. It's just the experiences that people are having.
So I think now we can move on to talking a bit more about like theological reflection on this, especially coming from where we're at now, you know, thousands of years from these ancient people that we've been talking about, how you've heard, you know, demons, evil, Satan talked about, and especially in relation to like media, maybe art as well, that has had some sort of impact on the way that we think about these things, because we don't live in a vacuum. We're influenced by lots of things all the time. So yeah, Laura, if you want to take the floor on this.
Yeah, so I grew up in a pretty traditional conservative church, but it was Quaker. It was very, very small, very rural. So a lot of stuff didn't come down the pike for us the same way it did in the larger evangelical church. Got to be 14, we started to go to like a much larger non-denominational evangelical church. And this is where I first started to hear about spiritual warfare talked about fairly earnestly. You know, people invoking this idea a lot, the idea that demons are real and they can hurt you. And I started interacting with pastors who had demon stories, you know, that the one that really stands out in my mind is somebody who he'd been attacked by some guy because of some dating dispute. I can't remember what it was. I think it was with his daughter. And the guy was able to like summon knives from around the kitchen while he attacked this guy. The sort of like very dramatic, you know, moving objects with their mind sort of. Sorry?
So that's pretty sick, actually.
So yeah, this being able to move things with your mind because of demonic forces. And when I got to be in college and I started to spend more time in like Christian church and parachurch groups, there were a lot of people who sort of had this idea, right, that personal demons on behalf of Satan are lending their aid to certain people to do things, and also they're attacking certain people in order to diminish their abilities, right? So what I find, you know, 10, 15 years out, thinking about all this stuff, talking about it now, I don't see these things being motivated by the Gospel of Mark. I don't see these narratives coming from the Gospel of Mark, because in Mark, the primary agent of these things is possession, right? Evangelical spiritual warfare discourse today has whole new categories for these things, like oppression, right? The idea that a demon might oppress you, might be involved in your life in a particularly bothersome way, right? Or that the idea that seemingly harmless things that you don't intend to be involved with demons can open a door to an unseen realm, right? The idea that like playing with tarot cards can basically create spaces that a demon can enter in, or that some people might be more vulnerable to these than others. I had a very good friend in college who had schizoaffective disorder. And I remember hearing from people in our churches that this can be that she might be more vulnerable to demons than other people because of the schizoaffective disorder. And here's at this late date, as a major horror head, absolutely live for horror movies. The thing I see in a lot of this is that the dominating narratives are not coming out of the Bible, and they're not coming out of even really Christian tradition in a lot of ways. They're coming out of derivatives of modern Christian media. So to start with, The Exorcist. Exorcist comes out in 1961 is the book, I think. The book by William Peter Blatty is written from a devoutly Catholic perspective. William Peter Blatty is himself a very devout Catholic, and he is very dedicated to preserving the Catholic dogma of what a possession is, because again, he's going with this possession model, which we have in Mark. So he's very black and white. There's a difference between just a demon being around and possession. He goes with this possession model. And then there is a motive that the demons have. The motive that the demons have is to diminish our love for God and our love for each other. And then there is the way in which it is solved is through liturgy, right? You say the right things. You have the relics in hand because this is a Catholic rite, right? That you have liturgy, you apply it, and then eventually you're able to cast the demon out. The Exorcist, if you haven't seen it, spectacular film. 71 is when the book comes out. 72 is when the movie comes out. Absolutely spectacular film. Exorcist is my all-time favorite movie. I love it, love it, love it. But because it is such a juggernaut at the American cinemas, it is at the time the highest grossing movie in the world until it is the highest grossing R-rated movie for a long, long time until it is overtaken in the 2000s by Passion of the Christ, which is really interesting. But yeah, so it has this massive place in culture. So there's a lot of imitators. So a lot of people take this thoroughly Catholic lore in The Exorcist and they start building on it without really understanding what they're doing. And then what's really fascinating is that theology, just as theology was feeding cinema starts to feed theology. So by the time you hit the 90s, you have people who have the idea of like independent deliverance ministries is huge in Catholics, in Catholic and Protestant circles. The idea that people can have sort of like quotidian disputes with demons who are bothering them, and they need some sort of ritual, but not necessarily a Catholic one to fight it, is showing up. So this is the landscape that was eventually really feeding American evangelicalism. The idea that demons are very active in the world, but in a lot of really variegated ways. In the ways in which you fight them are equally variegated, and sort of take a specialized person to defeat them in all their different ways. More analogous to a doctor than to a priest, right? That like instead of saying the liturgy, the exorcist looks at your symptoms and figures out how to respond to it. So that's a big change in the American landscape. When I today, some of you guys might know this, I am a minister. I work as a minister at a college, and I have students come to me regularly who want to know about demons, spiritual warfare, this kind of thing. And this is by far the most dominant narrative I see, is people who are thinking of demons in a way that is more in line with like the movie The Conjuring. The idea that like a demon is physically in your space and he's messing with things and you're trying to hold him off before he gets to the possession point. This is the thing I'm trying to see more and more of. Even though this has no analog in Mark, it has no analog in Paul, it has no analog in the Catholic tradition even.
So this is like a topic that me and my wife Trish have been like since bringing up.
Hi,
this
Trish!
thing. Yeah, she's not in here right now. But
No, I love her.
Yeah, she'll definitely listen for sure. And we've been talking, and so I think her understanding is more along the lines of what you just mentioned, like the very last part, like the more dominant understanding, which so just to kind of say, like, that's important, I guess, to note, like, where I think something that cleared up with what you were saying is like these dividing lines, like the difference between like a demon being something that possesses is actually different than like a demon being in the room next to you. And like
not
that's an important
distinction.
So that's enlightening. Yeah, so that's something I'd definitely like to highlight for people to kind of think about.
And who's like plotting to go after you. Like there's this sort of intention and plan that sort of is behind this, that they're on a mission from presumably Satan. And they show up, they do what they do. And then eventually the point is they get to a point where they, possess you.
When I was a teenager, I was really involved in a parachurch community that I actually really loved. I'm not knocking it. The Awakening community. It's related to the Chrysalis Emmaus Walk retreat program, which is I love it because it's a very like God's love centered way of introducing people to the gospel, and I find that very powerful and very meaningful. But because it all takes place in the 72-hour window of everybody sleeping in the same building and everybody sort of taking care of each other's needs, it can be very emotionally intense. that people are having very extreme feelings. And the way I think a lot of people experience it is that when people are feeling sort of disoriented or knocked off their game a little bit, there's this idea that a demon is screwing things up, right? So I've been in spaces with these retreats that if somebody is getting ready for to give like a talk or to give a message or something, and they don't feel right, there's this idea that the reason why this is happening is because there's a demon who's screwing it up, right? And then, you know, everybody goes around and decides, you know, like, we need to pray over the space and cast out the demons.
Yeah.
To be clear, I'm not totally opposed to that, because I do think the idea of sanctifying a space and praying for God's will to be done in a space is a theologically valid activity and experience. I do think is a dangerous and unhelpful way to think about demons, because it treats them as these sort of in-house saboteurs who have an agenda of their own. And that's attributing a lot of agency and personality to something that I don't think there is any theological reason to think exists. So, you know, when you look at something like, you know, Mark, or even like the Catholic dogma that's present in The Exorcist, the agency and the goal is very simple and deliberate. The goal is diminish love for God, right? Like, this is like, it's a reaction to the rule of faith idea that, like, if the rule of faith is cultivate love for God and love for neighbor, a demon tries to destroy love for God and love. The demon in The Exorcist, because he's a Catholic demon, does not come to like, he doesn't come to influence an election, right? He's not coming for that. He's coming for this very particular purpose. And there's a purity of decision and intention in The Exorcist that is very interesting and very theologically robust. But when this movie makes a shit zillion dollars, if everybody wants to make The Exorcist 2, you have a lot of people coming in who don't understand this lore the way William Peter Blatty did, and they're treating the Exorcist, the demons, like characters. So to give an example, is everyone here seen The Conjuring?
I have, yeah.
I think I'm pretty sure I have.
Okay, it's a longtime favorite of me and John's. But anyways, the demon in The Conjuring is a thing that emerges from a person who lived in the 18th century, who was like this vengeful woman who wants to carry out violence against children and influences mothers in order to do it. She's the Babadook, right? Like, she's just the Babadook. And that's attributing a level of motive and agency to demonic forces that has no root in the New Testament, has no root in the Catholic or Christian tradition, right? But it does make for a good story. So I think Christians watch these things and they just incorporate them back into their own theology.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And something else that we kind of talked about, and we moved, I don't know, I'm just curious like how this relates, because this was kind of experience we had and how you'd think about if somebody brought this to you or whatever. But so we moved into a townhouse, like, and this was right before we moved to North Carolina, and really it seemed pretty clear to both of us that like, and that there was something negative, and like this place was pretty bad, I guess, is like a simple way to say it. Like it really would seem weird that we would like have bad experiences or bad fights and stuff, and we would like get in the car and leave, and like things seem to get better almost pretty quickly sometimes. There could be a number of explanations. It doesn't necessarily have to be a demon. And I think so I'm just kind of curious what you think. Maybe just think about that. Maybe I'll add a little bit if you have any other questions or anything. But
I think places have spirituality. I think this is true, that there are things that, and it might be somewhat subjective, right? Like people don't always have the same experience at the same place, for instance. But I do think it's true that for some reason or another, people have experiences of mood shifts or turmoil or settledness in certain places. And I don't always know where that comes from, right? Like psychologically speaking, we know a fair amount about the fact that people respond well to like higher ceilings, for instance, and like higher light. That there's a lot of things that people just get comfort out of. There's certain colors that people respond to more positively than others. I'm not trying to treat all this as like reducible to discoverable psychology, but I do think that there is something that clearly happens to people psychologically when they're in certain spaces. I am not going to pretend that I understand the length and breadth of what that is. But I do think that one that's very demonstrable is that it can be reset, and that performing rituals in a certain space, for instance, is something that allows people to reclaim the space. And, you know, we can call that psychology, we can call it theology, we can call it spirituality. I don't really care why it works. I just know it does, right? Mm-hmm. You know, that like when people have negative experiences with the space, performing rituals in it to reclaim it is clearly effective. Like, people clearly find that effective. And I don't think that is just gullibility or suggestibility. There's something about the human mind that this works. What I would say to anyone, if you move into a new house or a new apartment, and you have this sort of unease with the space, I would encourage you to do a few things. The first is that I would start with a place that any anti-God force in the universe is already defeated, right? You know, we learned this in Colossians, that the powers and principalities are nailed to the cross with their written codes, right? None of that matters. All of that is defeated, right? So none of these things have agency or power in themselves. The second thing I would say is, in light of the fact that theologically we can feel victorious over these things, that we don't need to be deferential to them, it might be meaningful to undertake a ritual in the space to reclaim it for yourselves in a way that acknowledges the fact that Jesus has power over this, right? And that can look like a few different things, right? I like to hold a rosary a lot of the times. Like when I'm doing something that really stresses me out, I just hold a rosary in my left hand, or I might like say some of the prayers from the rosary. I have a friend who keeps holy water in his house that he just finds this meaningful to be able to use now and then. It just depends, right? Like, and you might not go in for embodied rituals. You might be someone who just prays in a certain space, right? But I think that the right attitude to approach this with is that the ritual is effective not because the ritual itself is efficacious, but because it is acknowledging something that is already true about the world and the space.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I that totally makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I would just add a little bit that I wouldn't want to deny, and Laura's not denying at all, I'm sure, that evil and the sort of nothingness of evil does have weird interruptions into our reality in ways that are kind of unexplainable. Yeah. And so I wouldn't want to deny that, like, yeah, maybe there is something that's
some people experience it more than others. Yeah, honestly, and yeah.
I have no reason to think that can't be the case at all. It is interesting, though. I was thinking about the Gospels too, and the connection here is that the appearances of demons occur just before or as they're being cast out. There's no story of them like being around. Like, we don't have like a history of like a demon being around for a long time and people trying all sorts of things constantly. And then eventually Jesus shows up. It's just, we get the arrival of the Lord who, once we get to the story, cast them out. That's all we see. And I think that's really telling, is that we can trust in the power of Jesus to cast out whatever we may be sensing as demonic or anti-God or whatever, because that's what we can trust. And that's the only place that the demonic has, is as it's being cast out. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, so we took a little bit of a break here, but my wife Trish hopped in because she has some thoughts on this whole topic as well. So you'll notice a little bit of a jump, but yeah, we just wanted to include this part because we really did have some good things to say, so a little good back and forth. But just for continuity's sake, I wanted to hop in from like when we're editing, just to give you a bit of context of why there's this little bit of a jump.
So like we keep arguing about like Satan and stuff like that, and how like I even hear it in BSF about how like Satan does, like, he doesn't have control of your life, but he does cause things to happen in spiritual warfare and stuff like that. But like he's over here saying like that's like Jesus already won, and like I get that. But for example, the townhouse, I would feel literally a bad presence overlooking me, like late at night. It was bad. Like, I did not feel safe.
Right.
And like I feel like I'm a very spiritually sensitive person. Like,
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I believe that there are demons. I believe there are witches. You know, like there are those things. Like people do practice those things. I'm not saying, I don't know, just like I feel like there is like an evil, but yes, I know that like the good is always going to win. I guess growing up, like I've always thought like Satan was always after Christians because like he was kicked out of heaven. And that might be like a charismatic type thing growing up. In Reformed churches, they don't really even talk about Satan.
Yeah.
And like I'm just like I get confused. I guess I get confused. Why would they even bring it up?
Right. Yeah.
The root of evil and like Satan and everything, like that was a big part of like learning the gospel.
Sure.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
No, I hear that.
Like,
well, and also getting really vulnerable here. It is hard to overstate the power of space in experiences of emotional harm or fear. I think, because like, this is something that John and I have talked about a fair amount. The college I work at right now is hard for me to be at, and it's hard for me to be there. I have to really steel myself to do it. So I don't think that the idea that a certain space would be really oppressive for you, I don't think that's just reducible to psychology. I don't want to just say like, oh, it's trauma. You can totally overcome it. But I also don't want to give fully over to the idea that there are personal beings in a space that are harming you, because I think that it is clearly true that people can have a relationship with a space that is dangerous and toxic the same way they can have that relationship with a person. And some people are more sensitive to that than others. It seems like you are a person who has a pretty sensitive relationship with space.
Like vibes and stuff like that pick up on that?
Yeah.
Real fast. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, real fast.
Yeah. So clearly, some people are more vulnerable to this than others. Like I wouldn't say I'm very vulnerable to it, but I'm definitely a little bit. And I think John actually is quite a bit more than me.
It's very vulnerable to especially changes in vibes, as you said. I think it's a good way to put it in like different spaces, different places. Yeah, super sensitive to it. It's hard. It is. As I was saying this a little bit before we took our break, but I have no reason to think that like what you've experienced isn't demonic or anything like that. I have no reason to think that you're misperceiving something, because I do think that
I literally would like see shadows.
Sure, yeah, and
I don't feel like my mind was playing. Like I would see shadows.
Sure. The way that I conceive of as demons or the demonic is they're kind of interruptions or eruptions of evil. I like to talk about evil as sort of nothingness or anti-God stuff. So this can kind of pop up in different ways, and they can take personifications in different ways too. I have no reason to think that you didn't experience that or anything like that. Like that, I believe you. I have no reason not to. I think in response to that and how we respond to it is the important thing. Because I think what can happen is, and I've had experiences with like supernatural, like Laura knows this. I've seen stuff that I can't explain. I don't really know how to explain it at all. What I think we do in response to that is the important thing. When we become, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but if we become a bit too infatuated, I guess, with thinking about Satan and demons and the sort of powers associated with that, it can be an easy thing to kind of shift over into forgetting about the victory that's happened. And I know that that's what Ethan has said. But I really do think that that's important to keep in mind, is that the most important thing about being a Christian is confessing and believing in and witnessing to God's victory. And so when we're in places and we're sensing things that seem off or that we don't know how to explain other than this is demonic, this is oppressive, this is suppressing me in some way. The only thing to do is to latch on to the thing that we know is true and that we really believe and confess. Because in some sense, we can say, yeah, we believe in demons, but not in the same sense as we believe in the Lord.
Yeah, right.
So
sure.
That's the thing we need to latch on to in those moments, is the thing that we really believe in and confess, right? Because at the end of the day, even though the demonic has real effects and influence in some sense on us here and now, what we know in the light of Christ is that they're relics of a world that has been exorcised by the gospel. they're not what's real. They
Yeah.
do have real effects, but they are not what's real.
Yeah.
They've been defeated. Okay. That doesn't mean we're not going to still experience kind of I think a way, I forget what theologian said this, when we experience the demonic, we're experiencing the thrashing final breaths of the beast who's been chained. That's what we're experiencing. We're experiencing this thing that's dying.
Another image I found very helpful is World War II soldiers from Japan who took like 30 years to surrender after the war. Is another image that's often helpful, that like they're still engaged in the battle, but like the war is not ongoing. In a lot of ways, I think that the imagery in the language I've found to be most useful of spiritual warfare in my life is the experience of having depression, right? So I've dealt with severe depression most of my adult life in some capacity or another, right? I have a lot of issues with depression. And the thing that has been most characteristic in my experience of depression is that depression is a liar. In that depression tells me things that aren't true, right? That things are hopeless, that things are never going to get better. The thing that I have really anchored onto in those times is the fact that it's not actually true, no matter how loud in my head it is, no matter how insistent that voice is, it's not actually true. So I think that, when we talk about things like Satan being real or demons being real, I think that the way I experience that is very analogous to depression being real, right? Is that like, it is as real as my experience right now is this voice of hopelessness is. And it is real as this despair and this uselessness. And yet, with the eyes of faith, the same way that you can see that Jesus really has triumphed over sin and death, that's actually not true, right? Like, the demon is bullshitting you. It's not actually accurate.
Yeah.
And that's, I don't know if that's a helpful image at all, but that's, it's very similar to the way I experience being depressed.
I don't know. I just get confused when he's like, Satan's not a real person. I guess I get thrown off by that.
So Satan not being a person is not the same thing as Satan having no power. These are two very different things. So when people say that Satan is not a person, what they're not saying is that there's no such thing as the satanic power. What they mean is that there's not this being named Satan who has agency and an agenda in the world that is like independent to or contrary to God. It's that Satan is sort of a force that has gone wrong in the world. It's a thing that's gone wrong in the world, right? So it doesn't have the level of power that an agent would have. The resistance to the idea of Satan as a personal being comes from the idea of resisting the idea that Satan is a fallen angel, right? Because there's no analog to this in scripture, right? Or in old Christian creeds, right? There's no deference to the idea that Satan
When you came up with it?
It's composite, right? Because you do have Hashatan in the Hebrew tradition, who's the accuser figure. What?
Yeah, but like that's not quite what.
No, you have
sort of
stages,
Satan,
right?
yeah.
You have a lot of stages, and then you have there's the being in the divine council who is challenging Jesus in the Matthew and Luke temptation stories, but that's still not quite our Satan, like the modern Satan, for example. And then you have fallen angels in Enoch, which is like an intertestamental text. That's still not demons. That's still not a fallen angel image, because the demons in Enoch aren't the fallen angels. They're the sons of the fallen angels that they have with the women, right?
So it's fallen angels.
Yeah. So the fallen angels in that text in Enoch have sex with women, and then they have
and
sons.
Genesis 6 is also in Genesis. Yeah.
They have sons, and those sons in that text end up becoming
they're the demons.
The demons.
Yeah.
Which is a bizarre way of it's very different than the way that we have sort of classically sort of understood what demons are. But that's really, I think, probably some of the roots of it. And then it becomes dramatized in sort of art later on.
Well, I mean, Paradise Lost is basically
Paradise
where
Lost,
Satan comes from in the modern conception, right? Yeah. Because like even in Dante, you don't have Satan as like ruler of hell, right? Satan is imprisoned in the lowest layer of hell under God's authority, which is very different. So I think that it takes a while for this image of Satan, the fallen angel, who is commanding legions of other fallen angels to really crystallize and come into perspective. Even though you do have traces of him in the New Testament, I'm not saying that there's no Satan in the New Testament. It's just that what the Satan, you can't even use it as a name. What the Satan looks like in the Bible is very variegated and complicated.
Yeah, it has a definite article. Yeah. The Satan.
Well, it's the accuser figure, right? Yeah. It's bound in with the idea of the angel that accuses you before God, right? So like when you have in Luke, Jesus saying that he saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. In Luke, this is not appealing to the image of Satan becoming a fallen angel to command an army of demons on earth. This is Satan being cast out of heaven because God no longer wants an accuser in his divine counsel. It's a very different image. So I think all of these things go together in some very complicated ways. To make a very long story short, I don't think any of this goes together in such a way that when you go into a certain house and you feel like trauma and anxiety and fear, I am not trying to say that what you're experiencing is not real. What I do want to be clear about is that this cannot be traced to the activity of a being who has intelligence and power of his own, who is trying to fight you against God, and where you have a deciding vote in who wins. These are vestiges of trauma and decay and harm, and God is victorious over it.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to think about things in a different way, especially stuff that has been so attached to the way that you learned your faith.
Yeah. Did I ever tell you like what happened when I was a little girl with like I went to this church. I think it was like a Calvary Baptist church.
Yeah, no,
and
tell me.
So like I was like probably like 6 or 7, and they had like some kind of like guy dressed up as Satan. And like, yeah, it was horrible. I was traumatized. I thought Satan was like in our backyard. I was so scared.
I had a super traumatizing Satan experience when I was 12 too. So yeah.
I'm just like, is Satan like behind? I think maybe that was like a traumatizing thing.
I'm sure that has impacted you in the way that you think about this quite a bit. So yeah.
One thing I will note, I mean, it is important to like recognize too, in like modern evangelical.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
It's like taken for granted that Genesis 1 talks about the Satan that like Trish is talking about here, right? Like they just basically take that for granted.
That the snake is Satan, right? Yeah.
That's what I was going to say, like coming from an evangelical standpoint, like everybody talks about Satan like he's a person.
Yeah.
So it's just like very hard. Yeah. Like that's something I like wrestle with because like I mean, we even talked about it in Bible study today, and I'm just like shutting my mouth. I'm like, I have no clue what I'm saying here.
Yeah. No, I mean, Christians do take it for given, for instance, that Genesis 3, the snake is Satan, right? Which is a move that Revelation makes, which is actually quite novel. To say that the serpent, the dragon, is Satan, it's been Satan the whole time. That's a move that Revelation makes, which is, and in the context of Revelation, how much weight are you going to put on any one articulation in Revelation, which is such a highly symbolic and abstract text, right? Because, the dragon also knocks stars out of the sky, right? And
yeah.
We don't take that for serious, So it's complicated. I mean, the reality is there's no singular image of Satan that emerges from the biblical text, I would say, especially one that is not informed that's not informed in some way by apocryphal text. The thing we are left with is sin, death, evil, and hell, which are powers in the New Testament. And the New Testament is very clear what happened to those. And I find that very comforting.
Yeah.
Obviously, it is true. People have intense experiences of darkness and evil they can't explain through material or psychological ends in this world, right? And just, John and I both know this in our own ways, in our own capacities, right? And, in my case, some of this is informed by trauma. I do have some, like, Satan-related trauma from being a little girl, in religious communities. But some of it's not. Some of it doesn't have origins in this. Some people really are just, I think, sensitive to the way spaces feel to us. And I don't want to I don't want to denigrate any of that. I don't want to say any of that's not true. And I also don't want to get into the idea that there is a material, dangerous entity that is bound to spaces that we have to defer to as Christians, because that's clearly not. Being a Christian means that we affirm that Jesus has already had the victory. And even if you have these responses, there is a way to answer and deflect it.
I was looking up a bit at how Bart deals with this question. And he has this funny, in his kind of classically dialectical way of talking about things. I wrote this down. He says, we don't confess or believe in demons, nor do we deny their existence, right? So we don't confess them, we don't believe in them, but we don't deny their existence, but we disbelieve in them when we proclaim the gospel. So the proclamation of the gospel is a proclamation of the disbelief in what God is eradicating. So he makes this move from we don't confess them or believe in them, but we don't deny their existence. We disbelieve in them as we're confessing the gospel. For me, that's a helpful way of thinking about this. Yeah,
for sure.
The people who I feel very drawn to and emotional towards when I talk about the subject are people who are afraid of demons, or people who are afraid of the power of demons in their lives, because that was me for a lot of my life. And I know so many students and so many kids who are like this. And I think that like the profound insight I have had as a Christian in my adult life is the idea that, as is endlessly repeated on the show, that Jesus really does love us, that God really does love us, and that God is really on our side. So in that case, opposition is heavily relativized. Any opposition that can be true whenever God is truly on your side doesn't really matter as much. And then the other thing is that there's a way of explaining salvation and God's power in evangelical circles that takes victory and takes energy and power away from Jesus and gives it back to negative forces. The idea that like we say the sinner's prayer so that we get to go to heaven when we die, but that doesn't do anything about our sin, but that doesn't do anything about our behavior. That doesn't change anything about us. And that's just garbage. That's not right? That Jesus' death is efficacious over sin and death in every possible capacity. If there is some power in your life that you find to be oppressive or restrictive or that you cannot deal with, that is something that God has dealt with. And the solution is not to find a new way to solve it. The solution is to ask God to show you a way to demonstrate his power over it. So this is what I would tell one of my students if they were in my office asking me about this.
Yeah, I think to kind of wrap up my thought, like the main thing I think my big takeaway is that I think the most important way to think about demons and stuff like this is basically the same way you think about sin, and which is like kind of the issue that you just got at. Like if a demon is bothering you, just like something you're doing is like you find a hard time stopping doing it, but you know it's wrong. It's not necessarily like work harder or like you're like you know, it's more like give it up to God, and he has already defeated this just like he's already defeated sin. Yeah, that's just my takeaway is like that no matter how you want to conceive of the like ontology of demons or whatever, like the thing that matters most is our response, and that we just trust that God has already defeated these things, and it's not up to us to beat them.
I also want to add a note of pastoral advice from people who are in a situation of advising and comforting others in the situation. I think one thing John and I kept trying to hit, because we had like a really shared instinct on this, is that the fact that Jesus has power over sin and death does not mean people are not experiencing this in really concrete realities. And I think part of the mechanism of defeat and the mechanism of overcoming this is showing acknowledgement for the reality this has in people's lives. So, not to be too quick to jump to, not to do spiritual bypassing, right? Not to be too quick to say, you feel this power of death in your life. You feel this power of hell in your life, but Jesus has already overcome it, so it's okay. And just like, what does this look like to this person? What form is this fear and this oppression taking to them? Because there's probably something going on there that is deeper than just the feeling itself.
Yeah.
That might have a root in their past, or some sort of that has a root in a thing they believe about God that's not true, or a thing they believe about themselves that's not true. And it's important to tease it out and expose it and defeat that along with defeat that in the conversation, because that's where actual like freedom comes from.
There's a temptation too to kind of obsess about this stuff, and I would just say I acknowledge the feelings that you're experiencing in response to whatever demonic stuff you're involved in, or that's pressing itself on you. But I think, as Laura has indicated too, the more we do that and kind of obsess about it and kind of get anxious about it and worry about it, the more we're giving it power it doesn't deserve, because it doesn't deserve that. It doesn't deserve our time and thought about what it is exactly, where it comes from, that sort of stuff. We're giving power to death when we should be focusing on the Lord of life, who brings life. That's the thing that Christians latch on to. It's not theorizing or speculating too much about this stuff, because we just can't, which is why I don't think I've made one video on nothingness on this channel and evil.
In like our situation where it wasn't like an everyday thing or anything, like no matter what it was, but it was a smaller part. Like you're better off like serving in your church or doing something like good in the world than you are like reading a book about demonology or something.
Right.
You're right. And like trying to understand it.
Exactly.
Yeah, giving force to it, for sure.
Demonology does a lot of damage to theology. It does.
It really does. It's an incredibly distorting power. And I don't say that. My goal is not to invalidate the experiences of people who have had these things. My goal is to put them in its proper place and to treat them more like the hangnails they are.
Thank you all for watching this podcast episode, our special Halloween edition.
Yay! Happy Halloween, everybody!
Probably gonna come out
it's probably going to come out on November 1st, or 2nd. I'm not sure. Right. Yeah, we're on episode 8. We've been having a really good time doing these kind of longer podcasts, Ethan and I, and it's been good seeing your responses to these and some of your engagement when we do these live some of the time, and it's been good to see some of the questions that come in. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please do that. Leave a like as well. Those things are really helpful to help our channel grow. If you're interested in supporting us in a different way, you can go check us out on patreon.com/apocalypse here as well, if you feel like that's a way that you want to contribute to and support what we do here. And thank you, Laura, my amazing wife. And thank you, Carl, who showed up a couple of times. Flannery was there as well. Ethan, as always, faithful co-host. It's been fun.
Sure. I love you guys, but I like John better.
Yeah. That's probably good. Yeah. And with that, this has been Apocalypse here.
Christianity, you can live.